She walked into that penthouse carrying two things that could have changed everything: a pair of tiny white baby shoes and a photograph of a heartbeat that wasn't hers alone. Isabella Marlowe believed she was bringing her husband the greatest news of their lives. Instead, she found the truth he had been hiding behind silk and power and the kind of smile that costs nothing to fake. What she heard through that half-open door didn't just break her heart. It ended her. And the most terrifying part? She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply disappeared and took his future with her. If this story already has you gripped, stay with me until the very end. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The elevator doors opened at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Isabella Marlowe stepped onto the 42nd floor of the Veyron Tower carrying a paper bag from the pharmacy and a weight in her chest she hadn't yet learned how to name. She wasn't supposed to be here. Lorenzo had been explicit about that the way he was explicit about most things. Calm, even. The kind of voice that doesn't raise itself because it has never needed to. The penthouse is for work, Isabella. It's not personal. It's just clean. You understand. And she had understood, or told herself she did, the way she had learned to understand so many things inside the 4 years of knowing him and the 2 years of being his wife. You adjusted, you accommodated, you found the edges of what was permitted and you stayed inside them because stepping over meant dealing with a silence that was somehow worse than being shouted at. But tonight was different. Tonight she was carrying a photograph of something impossibly small, a curve of spine and a flicker of heartbeat on a grainy ultrasound printout, and a pair of white baby shoes no bigger than her palm that she had bought on impulse from the pharmacy display rack because she hadn't known what else to do with the joy cracking through her ribs. She needed to tell him. She needed to see his face in the moment she told him, needed the real-time truth of it, whatever that truth turned out to be. She had her key card. He had never asked for it back. The hallway on 42 was lit low and quiet, the kind of expensive quiet that costs more per square foot than most people earn in a month. Isabella's heels were soft on the marble. She was careful about that without meaning to be. Careful the way you get when you live near someone whose moods you've learned to read from the sound of his footsteps. She was 20 feet from the office door when she heard his laugh. It stopped her the way a hand across the chest stops you. Not because Lorenzo Veyron never laughed. He did, in controlled doses, at the right moments, a social instrument, precisely deployed. But this was different. This was low and easy and unguarded, and she had never heard that particular register from him in the 2 years they'd been married. Not once. Not even in the quiet hours after midnight when the city went to sleep and she'd believed they were as close as two people could get. The office door was open 3 inches. Later, she would not be able to explain why she didn't announce herself. Maybe some interior part of her already knew. Maybe the body understands things the mind hasn't caught up to yet, and her body had simply stopped her feet and made her breathe shallow and made her stand still in the hallway like a woman waiting for a verdict that had already been delivered. Through the 3-inch gap, she could see the edge of his desk, the blue glow of a monitor, the pale gold of the side lamp. She could see Vanessa Vale standing close enough to Lorenzo that no reasonable professional distance remained between them. Vanessa, who had been his personal assistant for 6 years. Vanessa, who knew the accounts and the aliases and the legal architecture of everything Lorenzo Veyron touched. Vanessa, whose efficiency Isabella had always respected from a safe and formal distance. Vanessa, who was now leaning with her shoulder against Lorenzo's chest while he rested one hand on the edge of the desk and smiled down at her in a way that made the hallway tilt. "She still has no idea," Vanessa said. It wasn't a question. Isabella isn't built for this world. Lorenzo's voice was the same voice he used to tell her good morning, level, unbothered. "She's exactly what I needed. The right name, the right face, the right amount of quiet. She doesn't ask the questions that would require complicated answers. And when she finally does ask, she won't." He said it the way you say 2 + 2, mathematical, already solved. "She's too well-mannered, too afraid of what she might find. That's the whole point of her." The paper bag crinkled slightly in Isabella's grip. She went still again, that reflex of stillness that had gotten her through years of difficult rooms. The baby shoes inside the bag were small enough to fit in one hand. She was aware of them, the way you're aware of something fragile you're holding over a long drop. Vanessa said something else, softer, and Isabella didn't catch it. And Lorenzo laughed again, that unguarded low laugh, and Isabella took 3 careful steps backward down the hallway the way she had come. She did not run. Running would have required a destination. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She stood with her back straight and her hands around the paper bag and her breathing controlled and even. And when the elevator doors closed in front of her, she watched her own reflection for the 11 seconds it took to reach the lobby, and she didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. Not because she looked destroyed, because she looked completely, terrifyingly calm. It would be 4 hours before the calm cracked, and when it did, it was not in the way she expected. There was no collapse. There was no wreckage. She sat at the kitchen table of their apartment on the 31st floor with the paper bag in front of her and the ultrasound printout on the table and the baby shoes beside it, and she cried for exactly 12 minutes, ugly and silent, with both hands flat on the tabletop. Then she stopped, wiped her face, and began to think. She thought with the kind of clarity that only arrives after something essential in you has been severed cleanly. She thought about everything she had learned in 2 years of living inside the architecture of Lorenzo Veyron's world. She thought about the names and the account structures and the shell companies she had once asked about casually, and he had explained too much, underestimating her, the way powerful men often underestimate the women they've decided are decorative. She thought about the attorney she had met at a charity event 8 months ago. A woman, sharp, family law, who had pressed a card into Isabella's hand and said, "If you ever need anything, no judgment, call me first," with a directness that had seemed strange at the time and now made perfect sense. She put her hand on the ultrasound photo. She was not going to let this child grow up as another piece in someone's chess set. She was not going to let this child learn that love was something you performed for strategic reasons, that marriage was a cover story, that the most important thing in a family was how it appeared from the outside. Not this child, not hers. She made 2 decisions that night. The first was that she would not confront Lorenzo, not yet, and possibly not ever, because a confrontation would give him the chance to manage the situation, to deploy the level voice and the mathematical calm, and the explanation that would somehow leave her feeling unreasonable for being the one who was hurt. The second decision was simpler and more terrifying. She was going to leave, and she was going to do it right, and she was going to give herself enough time to do it safely. She folded the ultrasound photo and put it in her coat pocket. She put the baby shoes in the inner pocket of her bag, against her ribs. Then she went to bed and lay still in the dark for a long time, listening to the city 41 floors below, thinking about what she needed to do first. The next 3 weeks, Isabella moved like she was underwater. She went to charity lunches. She smiled at the right moments. She came home in the evenings and made the right sounds in the right rooms and touched Lorenzo's arm when he passed, and he touched hers in return, that automated tenderness of people whose marriage is a habit. And she felt nothing except a steady, cold clarity working its way through her system like a slow tide going out. She called the attorney on a Thursday from a payphone in a coffee shop 11 blocks from their building. "I need to move money without him seeing it happen." The attorney said, "Tell me what you have access to." "More than he thinks." There was a pause. "Good. Come in tomorrow. Use the side entrance." She went. She brought documents she had photographed carefully over the preceding weeks. Not theft, nothing illegal, simply information she had a right to as his legal spouse, documentation of her own financial position, traces of accounts that had her name attached even if she'd never touched them. The attorney was precise and thorough and asked questions without blinking, and Isabella answered all of them without the self-consciousness she might once have felt. She was not the woman from 6 months ago. Something had cauterized inside her. She filed for divorce quietly, on a Friday morning, through channels she had been coached to use, without drama and without warning and without asking for more than was legally hers. She took nothing that belonged to him. She had never wanted what was his. She had only ever wanted what she'd believed they were building together, and that thing she now knew had never existed. The day before she left, she walked through the apartment one final time. She touched the edge of the kitchen counter. She stood at the window and looked out at the city. She picked up a photograph from the side table. The 2 of them at their wedding, Lorenzo in a dark suit, her in a dress that had taken 6 months to choose. and she looked at his face in it for a long time. This man she had loved without reservation. This man who had used that love the way you use a tool and set it down when the work is done. She put the photograph face down and walked out. She took a cab to the train station and then another cab from the train station to a building in a part of the city where nobody knew her name. She had rented the apartment under her maiden name, Crane, Isabella Crane, a name she hadn't used in 4 years, and paid 3 months in advance in cash. She had a bag, she had her documents, she had the attorney's number and a bank account Lorenzo didn't know existed, and a child growing quietly inside her that she had not yet told a single person about except the doctor who'd taken the ultrasound. The apartment was small. The heating groaned. The window looked out at a fire escape and a strip of gray sky. She sat on the edge of the mattress the first night and put both hands on her stomach and talked to the child the way people sometimes talk in empty rooms, not expecting an answer, just needing to say it out loud. "I'm going to do this right," she said. "I don't know exactly how yet, but I'm going to do this right." She did not know that on the 42nd floor of Veyron Tower, her key card had triggered a security log that Lorenzo would not notice for 11 more days. She did not know that when he finally pulled the footage and saw her walking into his building and then back out 11 minutes later with the paper bag pressed to her chest, he would stand completely still in front of the monitor for a long time, saying nothing, while the marble quiet of his penthouse became something different, became the sound of a man beginning to understand, too late, what he had allowed to slip through his hands. She did not know any of that yet. All she knew was the weight of the baby shoes in her coat pocket and the gray strip of sky outside the fire escape, and the long, difficult, entirely hers road beginning in front of her. She got up. She unpacked the bag. She made herself a cup of tea with the small kettle the apartment came with, and she stood at the window holding it with both hands until the city went dark. And somewhere in that darkness, a man with power over everything except the one thing that mattered was about to start making mistakes. But those mistakes belonged to tomorrow. Tonight was hers. She turned off the light and let the quiet hold her, and for the first time in 2 years, the quiet felt like something she had chosen, rather than something she had been assigned. She didn't know yet that Marco Ryland had already been given her description. She didn't know that the best tracker in Lorenzo's network was sitting in a car 3 neighborhoods over, methodical and patient, working a list of names backward from the date of the divorce filing. She didn't know that Lorenzo had not eaten a real meal in 4 days, or that Vanessa Vale had watched him pull that security footage 6 times in a row with an expression on his face that she had never seen before and couldn't name. What Isabella Crane didn't know, as she stood in her dark apartment with one hand on her stomach and the city humming below her, was that the man who had decided she was too well-mannered to ask dangerous questions had finally asked himself the one dangerous question he'd been avoiding since the footage rolled across his monitor. What was in that bag? And Marco Ryland, methodical and patient, parked 3 neighborhoods over, was about to find out. Marco Ryland had been doing this kind of work for 11 years, and the thing he had learned, the one lesson that separated the men who lasted from the men who didn't, was that you never started with the obvious. Most people, when they ran, made the same mistakes. They went to family, they went to friends. They used their own name at least once in the first 72 hours because the brain under stress defaults to what's familiar, and familiarity leaves tracks. The trick was not to chase the person. The trick was to chase the habit. He started with the attorney. It took him 4 days to find the name. A woman named Claire Sutton, family law, solo practice, office on the 9th floor of a building on Callaway Street with a side entrance that the building's exterior camera caught at an angle too oblique to make faces, but good enough to catch the silhouette of a woman in a gray coat who moved the way Isabella Marlowe moved, deliberate and contained, like someone who had rehearsed the route. The filing had come through a shell of a shell, clean enough to make a first pass look like nothing, messy enough around the 3rd generation of documentation that Marco could see the seams. He didn't tell Lorenzo immediately. He sat with it for 24 hours because Lorenzo in his current state was not the Lorenzo who made good decisions, and Marco had learned the difference between the 2 men a long time ago. On the 5th day, he walked into the penthouse on 42 and set a single sheet of paper on the desk. Lorenzo looked at it for a long time without picking it up. "She filed herself out," Marco said. "Clean. She didn't try to burn anything, didn't touch the main accounts, didn't reach out to any of your competitors. She just..." left. Lorenzo picked up the paper. His face did the thing it did when he was processing something he hadn't anticipated, a stillness so complete it looked like he'd stopped breathing. "She's pregnant," Marco said. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Lorenzo set the paper down. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to the room and his hands at his sides, and Marco watched him from across the desk and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and Marco was smart enough to know it. "How far along?" Lorenzo said finally. Not a question. The inflection of a man confirming something he already suspected. 16 weeks, based on what I could pull from the clinic records. She went in under Crane, Isabella Crane. Her maiden name. Yes. Lorenzo turned from the window. His face had rearranged itself into something harder and quieter than what had been there a moment ago, and Marco recognized the shift because he had seen it before, had seen it every time Lorenzo moved from being caught off guard to being operational. It was not a good shift. It was the shift that had preceded some of the worst decisions Lorenzo Veyron had ever made. "Find her," Lorenzo said. "I know where she is." "Then why are you still standing there?" "Because I need to know what you want to happen when I do." The question sat in the air between them like something with weight. Lorenzo looked at him for a long moment. "I want to talk to her." "That's it." "That's it." Marco held his gaze for another second, then nodded once. "Give me until tomorrow morning." He found her on a Wednesday. She was coming out of a grocery store 2 blocks from the apartment building. No coat, just a dark sweater, a canvas bag over one shoulder, her hair pulled back the way she wore it when she wasn't expecting to see anyone. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the tiredness of a person who has been carrying something heavy alone for long enough that they've stopped noticing the weight and started just noticing everything that makes the weight worse. Marco stayed in the car. He took a photograph. He texted it to Lorenzo without comment. Then he sat and watched Isabella Crane walk down the block and disappear around the corner, and he thought about the 16 weeks, and he thought about the paper bag and the security footage, and he thought about the fact that she had not told a single person, not family, not friends, not a single name in her previous life, and he felt something he was not paid to feel and pushed it back down where it belonged. Lorenzo's response came 40 seconds later. "Don't approach her. I'll go myself." Marco stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed back, "That's a bad idea." The response? "I didn't ask." He drove back to Veyron Tower and went straight to Dante Riven's office on the 28th floor because something had been bothering him for 10 days and he had not yet identified what it was. And in Marco's experience, the thing bothering you that you can't identify is almost always the thing that matters most. Dante was 26, sharp in the way that young men who grew up with nothing and suddenly found themselves adjacent to power tended to be sharp. Fast processing, socially calibrated, good at reading what a room wanted from him and delivering it. Lorenzo had brought him up personally, which meant Dante owed everything he had to one man's judgment, which also meant, if that man's judgment ever wavered, Dante's position wavered with it. Marco stood in the doorway of Dante's office and watched him for a moment before Dante looked up. "You've been running search queries on Isabella Marlowe," Marco said, "through the secondary system, the one you think doesn't log." Dante's expression moved through 3 things very quickly: surprise, recovery, and then a very deliberate calm that was too polished to be genuine. "Lorenzo asked me to run background on her before the marriage. Old records. That was 2 years ago. He wanted an update. He didn't ask me to do it. Maybe he has different people for different things, Marco." The way he said it, light, friendly, with just enough edge to make it a challenge without being a declaration, made Marco look at him for a long time with the kind of attention that made most people in this building uncomfortable. "Sure," Marco said. "Maybe." He left without another word, and Dante watched him go, and the moment the doorway was empty, Dante picked up his phone and held it without dialing for almost 30 seconds, looking at the screen, his jaw working slightly, before he put it back down on the desk and turned to his monitor and stared at nothing. 3 floors up, Vanessa Vale was having the kind of day that comes after several weeks of smaller days that have been quietly terrible. She had watched Lorenzo pull the security footage 12 times now. She had watched him stop eating properly, stop sleeping with any regularity, stop performing the rituals of normalcy that kept his world running smoothly. She had watched him send Marco after Isabella and receive Marco's reports with the expression of a man absorbing information he doesn't know what to do with, which was an expression she had genuinely never seen on him before. She had also, in the 3 weeks since Isabella's disappearance, spent a significant amount of time examining her own conscience and had found it in worse condition than she'd expected. She hadn't meant for Isabella to hear. She hadn't even known Isabella was in the building. What she had meant, the honest truth of it, which she had been avoiding since the night it happened, was that she had been testing something. She had been testing whether Lorenzo, given the right moment and the right proximity and the right amount of unguarded ease, would say out loud what she had always suspected, that the marriage was transactional, that Isabella was a function rather than a choice, that there was space in his world that might still belong to someone else. He had said exactly that. And in the cold clarity of the weeks following, Vanessa had been forced to sit with the fact that hearing it had not given her what she'd wanted, and that what she'd actually done was hand a woman carrying her husband's child the confirmation of her worst fears through a 3-inch gap in a door. She didn't know about the pregnancy. Not yet. That information was still contained to Lorenzo and Marco did not share operational details with anyone except on a need-to-know basis, and Vanessa understood from the architecture of her own position that she was not going to be the first person who needed to know. What she did know was that something in the building had shifted, and that shift had a direction, and the direction was not good. She was thinking about this on Thursday afternoon when her desk phone rang, and it was Dante Riven asking her in a very casual voice whether Lorenzo had mentioned anything recently about changing the security access protocols on the secondary servers. "No," she said. "Why?" "Just housekeeping. Nothing important." He hung up before she could ask anything else, and Vanessa sat with the receiver in her hand for a moment, then put it down slowly, and thought about the question, and thought about Dante, and thought about the fact that in 6 years of working for Lorenzo Veyron, she had developed a very finely calibrated instinct for when something in this building was wrong. And right now, that instinct was making a sound like a fire alarm in a building where everyone else was still asleep. She picked up her phone and texted Marco 3 words. "Watch Dante Riven." Marco's response came 11 minutes later, which in Marco's language meant he had already been watching and was confirming rather than starting. Already on it. The problem with Lorenzo going to see Isabella himself was not that it was emotionally reckless, though it was. The problem was tactical. Isabella had left cleanly and quietly, which meant she had planned carefully, which meant she was not the woman Lorenzo had decided she was, which meant any approach that treated her like the woman Lorenzo had decided she was would fail immediately and make everything worse. Lorenzo understood none of this, or understood it abstractly in the way that people understand things that don't yet feel real to them. He drove himself, which was the first sign that the evening was going to go badly. No driver. No Marco. He parked 2 blocks from the building Isabella was in and sat in the car for 9 minutes with both hands on the wheel and the engine off, which Marco knew because Marco was 3 cars back in a vehicle Lorenzo hadn't seen, because Marco had been doing this long enough to know when Lorenzo needed supervision he hadn't asked for. Lorenzo got out of the car. He walked the 2 blocks. He went into the building and found the apartment number from the mailbox directory, and Marco watched him disappear through the lobby door and checked his watch and decided he would give it 15 minutes before he followed. It took 11. Isabella opened the door because she heard the knock and assumed it was her downstairs neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Ruth, who sometimes brought food up on weekday evenings with a cheerfulness that Isabella had started to genuinely depend on. She was already half smiling when she opened the door and saw Lorenzo, and the smile went out of her face the way a light goes out. She tried to close the door. He put his hand against it. Not aggressive, no force, just the flat palm of a man making a point about the conversation not being over before it had started. "I'm not here to drag you anywhere," he said. "I just need 5 minutes." "You don't get 5 minutes. Isabella, you don't get anything from me." Her voice was level. Not shaking, not raised. Level in a way that was somehow worse than either of those things, the way a closed door is more final than a slammed one. "You made a decision about who I was and what I was worth, and I heard it, and I'm done. You don't get to knock on my door now because the outcome of that decision is inconvenient for you. The baby, he said. The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripple of it crossed her face for exactly 1 second before she controlled it. Is mine, she said. It's also... Don't. The word was a wall. Don't finish that sentence. Don't come in here with the language of possession when you don't even know the first thing about what this has cost me. You want to talk about the baby? Then start by explaining to me why I should let the man who kept me like a prop anywhere near a child I intend to raise with honesty. Lorenzo had no answer for that. She watched him not have the answer, watched the machinery of him, the always present calculation, the management of outcomes, stall out in real time. And for the first time since that night in the hallway, she felt something that wasn't grief or fear or cold resolve. She felt something closer to recognition. This was the real man behind the penthouse, and the marble quiet and the level voice. This was what he looked like when the management failed. I know what I said, Lorenzo said finally. I know what you heard. Good. Then you know why I'm standing here and not somewhere further away. You stayed in the city because I'm not afraid of you. He looked at her, and something in his face moved that she didn't have a name for. I'm not asking you to come back, he said. Then what are you asking? He opened his mouth, closed it. The Lorenzo Veyron who had an answer for everything was standing in a narrow hallway in a building that cost less per year than one of his car leases, and he had nothing. I don't know yet, he said. It was possibly the most honest thing he had ever said to her, and she hated how much it landed. Go home, Lorenzo. She closed the door. This time he let it close. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the wood grain of the door, and then he walked back down the stairs and out through the lobby, and Marco was leaning against the car 2 blocks away with his arms crossed and an expression that said everything without saying a word. Don't, Lorenzo said. Wasn't going to. How long have you been here? Long enough. They stood in the street for a moment, the city noise filling the space between them, and Lorenzo looked up at the building's lit windows without being able to identify which one was hers. She's not what I thought she was, he said. No, Marco said. She wasn't. The distinction sat there between them, past tense and present, and Lorenzo heard it and said nothing, and got in the car. What neither of them knew, what Marco with all his operational care had not yet caught, was that 40 minutes earlier, while Lorenzo was still sitting with both hands on the wheel, working up the will to walk into that building, a different car had been parked on the opposite end of the block. A car that had followed Lorenzo from Veyron Tower. A car that Dante Riven had arranged to be there, driven by a man who worked for Ray Calder, Lorenzo's oldest and most patient rival. A man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of vulnerability. A crime lord distracted by personal wreckage, making unscheduled solo trips to a residential neighborhood, leaving his operation exposed at the seams while he chased something that couldn't be managed or controlled. The man in Calder's car had photographed Lorenzo entering the building. He had photographed Marco waiting. He had photographed the address, the mailbox, the lobby door. He had sent everything to Dante Riven, who had forwarded it to Ray Calder with a single line of text. She's here. And he's unraveling. Now is the time. And in an office across the city, Ray Calder looked at the photograph of the building where Isabella Crane was sleeping and smiled the way a man smiles when someone else's loss becomes his leverage, and reached for his phone. Ray Calder was not a man who hurried. That was the thing about him that most people misread. They looked at his age, 53, gray at the temples, the kind of soft weight around the middle that comes from 2 decades of restaurant meetings and negotiated settlements, and they read slowness. They read complacency. They read a man who had gotten comfortable and therefore gotten dull. Lorenzo had made that mistake once, early, and had corrected it, and the correction had cost him 18 months of careful repair work on the Eastern Distribution Network. He had not made the mistake again, but Dante Riven was 26, and 26 does not yet understand that patience in a dangerous man is not the absence of aggression. It is aggression that is learned to wait. Calder looked at the photographs for a long time. The building. The mailbox directory visible through the glass lobby door. Lorenzo's car parked 2 blocks over, which his man had caught at an angle that made the plates readable. Marco Rylan leaning against the hood with his arms crossed, that particular posture of controlled irritation that meant Lorenzo had done something Marco hadn't sanctioned. He set the photographs down and poured 2 fingers of bourbon and did not drink it immediately, just let it sit on the desk while he thought. The pregnancy changed things. Not sentimentally, Calder had not gotten where he was by letting sentiment redirect his thinking, but tactically. A pregnant woman living alone under a false name, estranged from a man with significant resources and significant enemies, was not just a loose thread. She was a pressure point. Apply the right pressure at the right angle, and the whole structure shifts. He picked up the phone and called Dante. "She doesn't know anything," Dante said immediately, which told Calder that Dante was nervous and that nervous people talk too fast to fill space. She left before she could accumulate anything operationally useful. Lorenzo kept her insulated. "I'm not interested in what she knows," Calder said. "I'm interested in what he feels." A pause. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to go see her," Calder said. "You're young. You're not Marco. She has no reason to associate you with anything threatening. Go see her. Tell her whatever she needs to hear to make her afraid of Lorenzo." Another pause, longer this time. "She's already afraid of him," Dante said. "Then make her more afraid. I need her to run. If she runs, he follows. If he follows, he's not watching his own house. You understand?" "Yes." "Dante." Calder's voice dropped half a register, the way it did when he wanted to make sure something stuck. "Don't be creative. Don't improvise. Say exactly what I tell you to say and nothing else." "I understand." He laid it out in 3 minutes. Dante listened and said nothing, which was the most disciplined thing Calder had ever heard him do. Then Dante said, "What if she doesn't believe me?" And Calder said, "She will," and hung up. He picked up the bourbon and drank it slowly and thought about Lorenzo Veyron, who had once been the most composed man in any room he entered, coming apart at the seams over a woman in a small apartment with a groaning heater and a fire escape view. And Calder thought, this is what happens when you spend 20 years being untouchable. You forget that the things that can reach you are never the things you defended against. They're always the things you dismissed. He smiled and poured another 2 fingers and began to wait. Isabella had not slept well since Thursday. It was not the insomnia of fear exactly. She had gotten past the worst of the fear in the first week, when every sound in the stairwell made her breath go shallow, and every unfamiliar car on the block snagged her attention like a fishhook. What she had now was something more granular and more exhausting, the inability to turn her mind off, the constant background processing of contingencies, the way her body had quietly rerouted its resources so that genuine rest felt like something that happened to other people. She was eating. She was taking the prenatal vitamins. She had found an OB 2 neighborhoods over who had taken her on without commentary, and who had, at the last appointment, told her the baby was developing exactly as it should, which Isabella had held on to like something physical in the days since. The baby is fine. The baby is on track. Whatever else is happening in the adult world above and around this small, growing life, the life itself is on track. She was making tea on Saturday morning when someone knocked on her door. Ruth, she thought. Ruth sometimes came on Saturdays with bread from the bakery on 5th. She set the kettle down and crossed to the door and opened it without thinking, still half in the haze of a bad night and a morning that hadn't fully assembled itself yet. Dante Riven was not someone she recognized immediately. He was young, dark-haired, dressed in a jacket that was slightly too nice for the building, but not so nice that it would have read as wrong on the street. He had an open face, the kind that read as approachable, slightly worried, like someone who'd worked hard to look like someone you could trust. "Mrs. Marlowe," he said. Then correcting himself with a slight wince, "Sorry, Ms. Crane, I'm sorry to come here like this." Isabella's hand went to the door frame, not gripping it, just touching it, the way you touch a wall in the dark. "Who are you?" she said. Not a question. A demand with the question mark removed. "My name is Dante. I work for Lorenzo. I've been with the organization for 4 years. He paused. "I'm not here because he sent me. He doesn't know I'm here. That's important. That's the whole point." She looked at him for a long moment. Every instinct she had was running a calculation she didn't have a name for, something below the level of thought, animal and fast. Say what you came to say, she said. She did not step back from the door. Dante looked at the hallway over his shoulder, a performed gesture, she would think later, too deliberate to be instinctive, and then looked back at her. He knows about the baby, Dante said. He knows how far along you are. He knows which clinic you've been using, and… He stopped, swallowed, did something with his face that looked like reluctance. He's been talking to a family attorney. His attorney, not yours. His. The kettle began to whistle in the kitchen behind her. She didn't move. He's going to file for custody, Dante said. Full custody. His attorney has already drafted the paperwork. The argument is going to be that you're financially unstable, living in unsuitable conditions, and that you concealed the pregnancy as an act of deliberate alienation. He said it the way someone says something they've rehearsed into sounding spontaneous. I'm not supposed to know this. I overheard it. But I couldn't not tell you. He treated you like a piece on a board. You deserve better. You deserve to know. The kettle was still going. Isabella turned and walked to the kitchen and took it off the heat and set it down carefully, both hands, and stood with her back to the room for 4 full seconds. When she turned around, Dante was still in the doorway. Full custody, she said. That's what the filing is going to argue. Based on financial instability. And the concealment. His attorney is going to frame the concealment as evidence of parental unfitness. Isabella looked at him. Her face was very still. She had learned in 4 years near Lorenzo how to make her face very still, and she was using that skill now not to manage him, but to manage herself, to keep the thing moving through her chest from reaching her expression. You've been with him 4 years, she said. Yes. And you're here because your conscience sent you. Something shifted in Dante's open face, barely perceptible. A tightening around the jaw, a micro-adjustment, the kind that only registered if you'd spent 2 years learning to read the small movements of a man who never showed you the large ones. I know how it sounds, he said. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to protect yourself. She nodded slowly. All right, she said. Thank you. He left. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it and her hands flat on the wood behind her and breathed, slow and deliberate, 4 counts in and 4 counts out, the way her doctor had told her, the way she'd been practicing since the 7th week, when the anxiety had first started spiking in her sleep. Then she went to her phone and called Claire Sutton. Claire picked up on the second ring. Has Lorenzo filed anything? Isabella said. Any custody motion? Any family law action? Anything with his attorney in the last 2 weeks? A pause. She could hear Claire typing. Nothing, Claire said. I have a watch on the docket. Nothing has been filed. Nothing has been initiated. If he were moving on custody, I would have seen it before it reached paper. Another pause. Why? What happened? Isabella stared at the wall across the kitchen. The water she'd been about to make into tea was sitting in the kettle going cold. Someone from his organization just told me he's planning a custody filing, she said. Full custody. Parental unfitness argument. The silence on Claire's end had a texture to it. That's not how Lorenzo's attorneys work, Claire said carefully. They're not custody attorneys. They're commercial litigators. If he were going to make a family law move, he'd need to bring in outside counsel, and that takes time, and that time leaves a trail, and I would see the trail. A beat. Isabella, someone fed you that information for a reason. Isabella closed her eyes. To make me run, she said. That would be my read, yes. She opened her eyes. The kitchen was exactly the same as it had been 30 seconds ago. The kettle, the counter, the gray strip of sky outside. And something in her had fundamentally rearranged itself in the space of one phone call, the way a dislocated joint being set back into place is the same joint it was before and completely different at the same time. Okay, she said. Thank you, Claire. She hung up and sat down at the kitchen table and thought about Dante Riven's open face and his too deliberate glance over his shoulder and the way he'd said he doesn't know I'm here with the exact inflection of someone who had practiced saying it. She thought about who else might want her to run. Who would benefit from Lorenzo being destabilized and distracted? Who might have someone inside Lorenzo's organization willing to be used as an instrument? She thought about the fact that she had given away her location. That Dante Riven now knew not just that she was in the city, but exactly which building, exactly which floor, exactly which door. She thought about what happened to pressure points when the wrong person found them. She picked up her phone again and was about to call Marco Ryland's number. She had it, had memorized it in the second year of the marriage out of some instinct for contingency she'd never fully examined, and then stopped. Because Marco worked for Lorenzo, and calling Marco meant putting herself in Lorenzo's hands, and she had spent 3 months building a life that didn't require that. She put the phone down, picked it up again, put it down. Then her door opened. Not knocked. Opened. Because Dante Riven had not, when he left, heard the latch catch behind him, and Isabella had not, still running Claire's words through her head, checked. He stepped back in quietly. He was alone. He was not performing anything anymore. The open, approachable face was gone, replaced by something flatter and more careful, the face of someone executing a plan rather than playing a role. "I need you to come with me," he said. "It's not a request. I'm sorry." Isabella stood up from the table. She did not step back. This was a thing she'd learned. You step back and you give a room, and the room becomes theirs. "You're going to take me somewhere," she said. "And then what? You hand me to Calder?" The name landed on him like a slap. His composure held, but the edges of it went slightly ragged, and she watched him not deny it, and understood she was right. "Lorenzo put you in danger by coming here," Dante said. "Calder already knew about you before I did." "I didn't. This wasn't supposed to go this way." "What was it supposed to be?" "You were supposed to run, that's all. You run, Lorenzo follows. Calder gets 2 days with an unguarded operation and takes what he needs, and nobody gets—" He stopped. "Nobody gets hurt," Isabella said. "That's what you were going to say." He didn't answer. "A pregnant woman in a car going to Ray Calder," Isabella said slowly, working it out as she spoke, "is not nobody getting hurt. That's a hostage, Dante. That's a leverage play. Calder doesn't want me safe. Calder wants Lorenzo desperate." Something moved through Dante's face that might have been the beginning of the real thing, not the performance, not the plan, but the actual recognition of what he'd put himself in the middle of. "He said it would be clean," Dante said. "They always say it'll be clean." He was close enough now that she could see his hands. He was not reaching for her. His hands were loose at his sides, but tension ran through them the way tension runs through something that's been wound too tight for too long. Isabella thought about the baby. She thought about 17 weeks and a heartbeat on a grainy printout, and the tiny shoes in the inner pocket of her coat hanging by the door. She thought about the fact that the only person who knew where she was, who was not currently standing 6 feet from her with a plan that had already gone wrong, was a woman named Claire, who she had spoken to 3 minutes ago. She thought about Lorenzo. She thought about every reason she had not to call him, and she thought about one reason that outweighed all of them, which was the child between them, and the fact that the man 6 feet away from her was not going to listen to her reason her way out of this. She took a breath. "I'll come with you," she said. Dante relaxed. 1/2 inch, not more, but she saw it. "But I need my coat," she said. "It's cold." He nodded. She crossed to the hook by the door, the coat hanging there, the baby shoes in the inner pocket, and she reached for it, and while her back was to him and the coat was in her hands, she pressed send on the text she had typed left-handed and one-eyed in 30 seconds, while she was still sitting at the table. One word. To Marco's number. Here. And the address. Auto-completed from the last time she'd texted it to Claire. She put the coat on. She turned around. She looked at Dante Riven, who had betrayed the man who made him, and was now standing in her apartment with the consequences of that betrayal assembled around him like a room he couldn't find the door out of. "All right," she said. She walked toward him, and as she passed through the doorway of her own apartment into the narrow hallway she had come to know over 3 months of careful and solitary survival, she felt the baby shoes press against her ribs through the coat lining, and she thought, "I'm not doing this for him. I'm not doing this for the marriage or the name or the life I lost. I am doing this because the only thing that matters now is the 17 weeks, and I will burn every bridge I built and call in every debt I don't owe and stand next to a man I have every reason never to speak to again if that is what it takes to keep her safe." The elevator came. They got in. The doors closed, and in the mirror panel of the elevator, Isabella watched her own face. Still, controlled. The face of a woman who has made her decision. And she watched Dante beside her, his jaw tight, his hands still loose. A young man who had made a series of choices that each seemed small and was not. And she thought, Marco will come. Marco is good at his job. Marco will come, or Lorenzo will come, or both of them will come. And when they arrive, everything about this situation will change. What she did not know, as the elevator descended and Dante stared at the floor numbers counting down, was that Marco had received her text 11 seconds after she sent it and was already moving, and that he had called Lorenzo before he'd even reached his car, and that Lorenzo had picked up on the first ring, which he almost never did, and that the word Marco used, compromised, had sent Lorenzo out of the Veyron Tower lobby at a speed that the two men at the door had never seen from him before. What she also did not know was that Ray Calder, informed by his man outside that the woman was being moved, had made a second call to a second man, instructing him that if Lorenzo Veyron showed up at the building before the transfer was complete, the situation was to be resolved in the manner that left the fewest complications. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. Dante put his hand on her arm, not rough, almost apologetic, and guided her toward the glass front door. And through the glass she could see the street and the afternoon light and a black car she didn't recognize parked directly in front with its engine running. And she understood that whatever was coming next was going to happen in the next 4 minutes, whether she was ready for it or not. The glass door was cold under Isabella's hand. She pushed through it, and the afternoon hit her. The wind off the street, the exhaust smell of the idling black car, the particular quality of city light in late October that makes everything look slightly more real than it should. Edges too sharp, colors too specific. The way things look when your body has made the executive decision that this is a moment you will remember and has turned the resolution all the way up. Dante's hand was still on her arm, not gripping, guiding. The distinction mattered to her in a way she couldn't have explained. It meant he was still performing the role of someone who had a plan, which meant the plan had not yet entirely collapsed, which meant there was still a window between now and the black car where something could change. She counted 3 steps from the lobby door to the sidewalk. On the second step, the black car's front passenger door opened, and a man got out who was not Calder and was not anyone she recognized, but who had the particular build and the particular economy of movement that she associated, from 4 years of peripheral observation with men who were paid specifically for situations that required them to be larger than the problem. On the third step, she heard tires, not the black car. Something else coming fast from the left, and Dante heard it too because his hand tightened on her arm for the first time, actual grip, and he turned toward the sound and she felt him tense through the contact of his hand on her arm, the way you feel a vibration through a wall. Marco's car came around the corner at a speed that was not legal and not subtle, and did not need to be either, and it stopped at an angle that blocked the black car from the street. Not precisely, but enough. The way a body thrown in a doorway doesn't have to fill it perfectly to slow what's coming through. Marco was out before the car had fully stopped. He moved the way he always moved. No wasted motion, nothing telegraphed, the flat efficiency of someone for whom physical situations were a professional category rather than an emergency. And he put himself between Isabella and the man from the black car and said nothing at all. The man from the black car looked at him. "Walk away," Marco said. "Can't do that." "You can. You're making a choice right now about who you want to have a problem with. Choose carefully." 3 seconds. The man looked at Marco's hands, which were loose and ready at his sides. He looked at the angle of Marco's body. He looked at whatever it was in Marco's face that men who do this kind of work learn to read in other men who do this kind of work. He got back in the car. Dante had gone completely still. Isabella felt it through his hand on her arm, the full-body stillness of someone whose plan has just been structurally compromised and who is rapidly calculating what the new situation requires. She pulled her arm free. He let her go. That was the most important thing. He let her go, which meant whatever calculation he was running had just concluded that holding on to her was a cost he couldn't afford. She stepped toward Marco, and Marco looked at her once, a quick, thorough look, the look of someone taking inventory, and then looked back at Dante. "Get in the car," Marco told Isabella. Lorenzo, he's 3 minutes out. Get in the car. She got in the car. Through the windshield, she watched Marco and Dante face each other on the sidewalk. She couldn't hear what they said. She watched Dante's open face do something she hadn't seen it do before. It closed. Whatever was left of the performance fell away, and what was underneath was younger and more frightened than anything that had been visible before. A 26-year-old who had made a catastrophic miscalculation and was standing in the full light of it. Marco took out his phone, made a call, kept his eyes on Dante. Dante did not run. Isabella thought about that later, the fact that he didn't run, and concluded that he understood, on some essential level, that running was no longer a category of option available to him. That the moment Marco's car had come around that corner, the map of possible futures had reduced to a very small number of rooms, and none of them had exits in the direction he'd been planning to go. Lorenzo arrived in 2 minutes, not 3. He pulled up behind Marco's car, the same car from Thursday, no driver, and he got out and looked at the street. The black car, Marco, Dante, the angle of everything. And his face did the thing it did when he was processing a scene rapidly, reading the spatial relationships and the body language and the residue of what had already happened, assembling it into a sequence. She watched him do it through the windshield. She watched the moment he understood. He looked at Dante. Whatever Lorenzo Veyron felt in that moment, it did not reach his face. His face was the face he wore in rooms where loss of control was not permitted. His face was the 42nd floor, the marble quiet, the 2+2 voice, and yet something in the set of his jaw and the particular stillness of his hands at his sides communicated something that bypassed the face entirely, something that went straight to the animal part of the brain that knows the difference between a man who is angry and a man who is dangerous. He walked to Dante. He stopped 2 feet away. "Tell me," he said. His voice was level. It was the most frightening version of his voice. Dante told him. Not everything. Not yet. Not with the street around them and the black car still at the curb. But enough. Calder's name. The plan. What he'd told Isabella and why. He spoke in a flat, rapid monotone, the voice of someone making a confession that has passed beyond strategy into something more basic, the simple animal need to stop carrying the weight of it. Lorenzo listened without moving. When Dante stopped talking, Lorenzo was quiet for 4 full seconds. Then he said, "Get in Marco's car." "Lorenzo, don't talk. Get in the car." Dante got in Marco's car. Lorenzo came to the passenger side of his own car and opened the door and looked at Isabella, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the street noise filling the space between them. A cab horn somewhere. The wind. The particular urban silence that is not silence at all, but the accumulation of 1,000 small sounds that cancel each other out. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." He nodded, got in the driver's side, sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. "I need to deal with Calder," he said. "I know." "That means tonight. It can't wait." "I know, Lorenzo." He looked at her then, and whatever was in his face was not the 42nd floor and was not the marble quiet. It was something rawer and less managed and more real. The face she'd glimpsed for 1 second in her apartment doorway when she'd asked him what he was asking for, and he'd said, "I don't know yet." "I need you somewhere safe while I do," he said. "I can go to Claire's." "Who's Claire?" "My attorney." Something moved in his face. Not quite a wince. The acknowledgement of a thing that had a shape he hadn't expected. "All right," he said. "I'll take you there first." He started the car. He pulled out around the black car, which had not moved, the man inside it having made his calculation and was now presumably on the phone with Calder, describing how the afternoon had gone, and Lorenzo gave it one long look as he passed, and then looked back at the road and drove. They were 6 blocks from Claire's building when Isabella said, "He told me you were filing for custody." Lorenzo's hands moved on the wheel, an adjustment barely visible. "He told you I was filing for full custody," he said, "on grounds of parental unfitness." "Yes." "And you believed it?" She looked at him. "For about 3 minutes, then I called my attorney." He was quiet for a moment. 3 minutes, he said. "It was a credible story, Lorenzo." It fit everything I already believed about you. The car stopped at a red light. He stared through the windshield at the cross traffic. I know, he said. She looked at his profile, the jaw, the line of his mouth, the thing he was doing with his hands on the wheel that was the closest she had ever seen to him not being in control of what his hands were doing. She thought about the 3 minutes she had stood in her kitchen with Claire's words dismantling Dante's story, and she thought about the fact that the story had been credible not because Dante had been skilled, but because she'd had 2 years of evidence for it, because it had fit the man she'd believed she'd married. The light changed. He drove. They didn't speak again until he pulled up in front of Claire's building. I'm going to end this tonight, he said. By doing what? By talking to Calder directly. She looked at him. I'm not going in armed, he said. That's not what this is. Calder is a businessman. He moved on me because he saw an opening. I'm going to close the opening, negotiation, a new agreement, something that removes his incentive to use you as leverage. He paused. It's the only play that doesn't turn into something worse. And Dante is a separate problem. He's 26, Lorenzo. I know how old he is. I was there when he was 22 and had nothing. The flatness in his voice was not cold. It was something more complicated than cold. That doesn't change what he did. She looked at her hands in her lap, the coat, the inner pocket where the baby shoes pressed against her ribs. No, she said. It doesn't. She got out of the car. He didn't move to stop her. She was 3 steps from the car when she turned back. Lorenzo. He looked at her through the open door. Come back, she said. Not be careful. Not I forgive you, not any of the things that would have required her to be further along than she was. Just that. Come back. The minimum true thing she had available. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and drove. She stood on the sidewalk and watched the car until it was gone, and then she went inside. Ray Calder's office was on the 14th floor of a building that housed a legitimate import consulting firm on the floors below, and several things that were not that on the floors above. Lorenzo had been in the building once before, 7 years ago, for a meeting that had established the original terms of a non-interference agreement that had held, imperfectly but functionally, for most of the time since. He remembered the elevator. He remembered the way the carpet on 14 was slightly nicer than the floors below it. He remembered Calder's assistant, a different one now, a woman with short gray hair who looked at him with no expression whatsoever and said, Mr. Calder is expecting you, which meant Calder had known he was coming before Lorenzo had called, which meant Calder had resources watching Veyron Tower, which was not a surprise and was still unpleasant to confirm. The office was large and warm and smelled like old wood and the particular staleness of rooms where serious conversations have been conducted for a long time. Calder was behind his desk. He did not stand when Lorenzo came in. Lorenzo sat down without being invited. The assistant closed the door behind him. Dante's in custody, Lorenzo said. Whatever he sold you, I know what it is. Whatever advantage you thought you were buying, the shelf life on it is roughly 12 hours from now. I want to talk about what comes next. Calder looked at him with the unhurried attention of a man who has never needed to perform urgency. You drove here yourself, Calder said. No security, no posturing. He tilted his head slightly. That's either very confident or very stupid. It's neither. It's practical. I'm here to negotiate, not threaten. Threatening requires leverage, and tonight we both know your leverage walked out of a building in Marco Ryland's car. Calder was quiet for a moment. The woman is fine? The woman is fine. Good. And the thing was, the maddening, disorienting thing was that he seemed to mean it. I don't make war on pregnant women, Lorenzo. That was always going to be a pressure play, not an endgame. I needed you off balance, not bereaved. You needed me distracted. I needed you human. Calder picked up the bourbon glass from the corner of his desk. You've been running that operation like a machine for 6 years. No visible weakness, no personal stakes, nothing to press on. And then your wife walks out carrying your child and you start driving yourself to residential neighborhoods at night without telling your security chief. And suddenly, you're comprehensible. He paused. Comprehensible men are easier to work with. Lorenzo looked at him for a long moment. "What do you want?" Lorenzo said. "Access to the harbor logistics on the south end. 3 shipments a quarter, my cargo, your infrastructure. Fair rate. Clean paper. The south end has obligations. That you can renegotiate. You're good at renegotiating." Calder set the glass down. "I'm not trying to take your operation, Lorenzo. I'm 63 years old. I'm tired of building things from the ground up. I want to use what already exists. That's a different ask. And in return, Dante Riven's usefulness to me ends immediately. Whatever he told me, I'll have my people confirm independently and then destroy the copies. You handle your internal problem your own way." He paused. "And I stop looking at your personal life as a strategic resource." The room was very quiet. Somewhere below them, the building hummed with its own legitimate business, the floors of import consulting and whatever else, the machinery of a city that did not know or care what was being agreed to on the 14th floor. Lorenzo thought about Isabella standing on the sidewalk outside Claire's building, saying "come back" in the voice of someone offering the minimum true thing they had available. He thought about 17 weeks and a heartbeat and a pair of baby shoes he had never seen, but could picture with a specificity that made the back of his throat ache. He thought about what it meant to make this agreement, the South End infrastructure, the ongoing relationship with a man who had just used his unborn child as a pressure point. He thought about what it meant not to make it. "I want it in writing," Lorenzo said. "Not formal, not anything that creates a trail, but witnessed. Your assistant and Marco." "Marco is here?" "He's in the lobby." Calder looked at him for a moment with something that might have been appreciation. "You came to negotiate, and you brought your security chief." "I said I came to negotiate. I didn't say I was reckless." Calder smiled. The real one this time. Not the waiting smile, but the one that acknowledged when someone had played something well. "Call him up," he said. "Let's finish this." Lorenzo took out his phone. While it was ringing, he looked at the window behind Calder's desk, the city grid below it, the lights coming on as the afternoon went fully dark, and he thought about the fact that this was what he was. This was the man he had built, the man who sat in a room like this one and made agreements that kept the machinery running and called it protection. He thought about the specific cost of that, what it had required him to believe about himself, what it had required him to dismiss about everyone else. Marco answered. "Come up," Lorenzo said. 14. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at Calder. "After tonight," Lorenzo said, "I want Dante Riven out of the city." "Agreed. And if your people ever get near my family again, they won't." Calder said it simply, without the architecture of a threat. "I told you, I'm not interested in that kind of cost." He paused. "Finish what you need to finish with Dante, and then go be with your wife, Lorenzo, or whoever she is to you now." His eyes were steady and unreadable. "You look like a man who hasn't slept in 3 weeks." "I haven't." "I know." The elevator outside opened with a sound like a breath held and then released, and Marco's footsteps came down the hall, and Lorenzo straightened in the chair and put his hands on his knees, the posture of a man preparing to close something, and he thought, "This is not the end of who I am, but it is the beginning of the question of who I intend to become." The door opened. Marco came in. He looked at Calder and then at Lorenzo with the expression of a man who had been doing this long enough to read a room's outcome from the temperature of the air before anyone spoke. "We're finalizing an agreement," Lorenzo said. Marco looked at Calder. "The woman is not part of any future arrangement." "Agreed," Calder said. "Her name doesn't appear in anything your people track." "Agreed." "And Riven doesn't walk," Marco said. "Whatever you agreed, he doesn't just walk. He answers for what he did." The room went very still. Lorenzo looked at Marco. Marco looked back at him, not with insubordination, but with the directness of a man who had stood beside Lorenzo through enough consequences to have earned the right to name them when they mattered. "He answers," Lorenzo said, "but I decide what that means." Marco held his gaze for one more second, then nodded. Calder reached into the desk drawer and produced a single sheet of paper. Already prepared, Lorenzo noticed, the specific terms already typed, which meant Calder had known with reasonable confidence what Lorenzo would agree to, which meant the entire evening had been built toward exactly this room and exactly this agreement, and the pressure on Isabella had been precisely calibrated to make Lorenzo willing to walk through this particular door. He picked up the pen. He thought about the woman in the small apartment with the groaning heater and the fire escape view who had built a survival plan without him and then sent him one word, "Here," when the alternative was worse. He signed, and in that moment, 3 floors below in the lobby, a man Lorenzo had never seen before was stepping out of a stairwell door with a phone pressed to his ear, relaying to someone on the other end that the meeting had gone long, that both parties were still in the building, that the situation was contained. And across the city, in a car parked outside Claire Sutton's building, another man was watching the lights in the window on the 3rd floor. Go on and stay on, waiting for a signal that had not yet come and would not come, and whose absence meant something was wrong. And he reached for his own phone just as the light in the 3rd floor window went out, and the street below went quiet. And inside Claire's office, Isabella Crane sat in a chair across the desk from her attorney with both hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold, staring at nothing, waiting for a man she had every reason not to trust to walk back through a door she had not yet decided whether to leave open. Lorenzo came back at 11:47. Isabella knew the time because she had been watching the clock on Claire's office wall with the involuntary precision of someone whose body has decided that tracking minutes is the only productive thing available to it. Claire had fallen asleep in her chair an hour ago, her reading glasses still on, a brief for another case open on the desk in front of her, and Isabella had not woken her because there was nothing useful Claire could do while awake that she wasn't doing asleep, which was simply being present in the room, and presence, Isabella had learned in the last several months, was not nothing. The knock was quiet, 3 times. She knew it was him before she opened the door. He looked like a man who had been through a wringer that left no visible marks. His jacket was on, his tie still knotted, and if you didn't know what to look for, you might not have seen the exhaustion. But Isabella had spent 2 years learning his face with the involuntary thoroughness of a woman who understood. On some level, she hadn't consciously acknowledged that his face was a document she would someday need to read accurately. And what she saw now was a man who had spent 4 hours in rooms where the cost of everything had been precisely calculated and paid. "It's done," he said. Calder. "New agreement." He backs off. The leverage he thought he had is gone. And Dante. Lorenzo was quiet for a moment. "He's out of the organization. He'll leave the city by the end of the week. I didn't—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't hurt him." She looked at him. "He's 26, Lorenzo said. He was afraid, and he made the choice afraid people make, which is to sell the present to buy a future that doesn't exist." He paused. "I know what that looks like. I'm not in a position to be the one who punishes it too hard." Claire stirred in her chair behind Isabella and made a small sound, resettled without waking. Isabella looked back at Lorenzo in the doorway. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat in the chair across from Claire's desk, the client chair, the one Isabella had been sitting in for the last 4 hours. And he put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands and stayed like that for a moment, not performing anything, not managing anything, just a man putting his face in his hands because he needed somewhere to put it. Isabella sat on the edge of the desk. She did not touch him. She was not there yet, and she was not going to pretend she was. But she sat close enough that he would know she had chosen to sit close, that the proximity was intentional, and she waited. He lifted his face out of his hands. He looked at the floor. "Vanessa is gone," he said. Isabella said nothing. "I asked her to resign this morning, before any of the rest of this." He said it to the floor. "She didn't argue. I think she'd been expecting it since the night since the footage." He paused. "She knew what she'd done. She didn't know you were there, but she knew what she'd done." "What did she do, Lorenzo, in your version?" He looked up at her then, and the question landed on him the way she'd meant it to. Not as an accusation, but as a demand for specificity, for the honest accounting that she had never gotten and that she needed now, not for the marriage, but for herself, for the closed chapter, for the document she needed to be able to file correctly before she could move forward. "She tested me," he said. "She wanted to know if I would say out loud what she suspected I believed. And I did. I said it because I was arrogant enough to believe the room was private and small enough to believe it was true. He held her gaze. It wasn't true. It was the story I told myself about my own marriage because the true story was more frightening. What's the true story? That I loved you and didn't know how to be that. That love felt like a liability in the world I'd built, and so I packaged you into something I could manage. A function, a role, a piece of the architecture that I could maintain at a safe distance. He said it without looking away, and the effort of that was visible. A man holding eye contact with the specific thing he'd been avoiding. You were never quiet because you didn't have opinions. You were quiet because you were watching. And I told myself the watching was passivity. Because the alternative, the idea that you were reading me, understanding me, building a map of everything I was too much to sit with. The clock on the wall moved its minute hand with a soft, mechanical click. Claire's breathing was slow and even in the background. I heard everything, Isabella said. In that hallway, I heard the whole thing. I know. And I stood there for, I don't know how long, with the shoes in my hands, and I made myself be still the way I'd learned to be still around you, because stillness was safe, and I thought, this is the last time. This is the last time I make myself small to fit the space he's decided I occupy. Lorenzo looked at her with the expression of a man receiving something he knows he has no right to ask to be delivered gently. I'm not asking you to forgive it, he said. I'm not asking you to come back to the marriage or the building or the name. I'm not asking for anything that belongs to the before. He paused. I'm asking to be in the room when she's born. I'm asking to be somebody she can look at and not have to explain away. The room held that for a moment. That's not my decision alone, Isabella said. That belongs to her too. When she's old enough to have the decision. I know. And it requires something from you that you've never actually done. Not promises. Not the right words in the right order. You're good at words, Lorenzo. You always have been. I need actions, and I need them over time, and I need them when nobody is watching and there's no audience and there's nothing to manage, because that's when people show you who they actually are. I know that too. Do you? I'm starting to, he said. I'm not going to tell you I've arrived there. I'm telling you I'm starting to understand what the road looks like. It was, again, the honest answer rather than the strategic one. She was beginning to think that this slightly wrecked, slightly exposed version of him, the version that said, I don't know yet and I'm starting to, instead of the managed certainty she'd married, might be the actual man, the one that had been underneath the whole time, poured into the architecture of the life he'd built over it. She didn't know yet what to do with that man, but she knew she wasn't going to pretend he wasn't there. Go home, she said. Sleep. Come back in the morning and we'll talk about what this looks like going forward. Practical things. Where I live, what the birth plan looks like, what your involvement means in concrete terms. She held his gaze. Not tonight. Tonight has been enough. He stood. He straightened his jacket with the automatic gesture of a man who has worn tailored clothes long enough that adjusting them is reflexive, and then he caught himself doing it and stopped, like a man noticing a habit for the first time. He looked at her. Thank you for the text, he said. The one word. She looked back at him. I sent it to Marco. I know. He called me before it finished arriving. She held his gaze. I didn't send it for you. I know that too, he said. He left. She listened to his footsteps in the hall, the elevator arriving, the doors closing. Then she turned and looked at Claire, who was awake, had possibly been awake for several minutes, Isabella couldn't say, sitting in her chair with her glasses on and her hands folded on the desk brief in front of her, looking at Isabella with the expression of a woman who has spent 20 years in family law and has learned to be quiet in the presence of things that are still in process. You're not going back to him, Claire said. Not a question. Not the way I left, Isabella said. But it's not finished. It's just different now, different shape. Claire nodded slowly. That's usually how it goes, when it goes at all. Isabella put her coat on. The baby shoes pressed against her ribs, that familiar pressure, and she put her hand over the pocket for a moment from the outside, just briefly, just the touch of it. Same time Thursday? Claire said. Same time Thursday. She went home. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. The kettle on the counter, the chair pushed back from the kitchen table at the angle she'd left it when she'd gone to the door for Dante. The gray strip of sky outside the fire escape beginning to lighten at its lower edge, with the earliest suggestion of the hours before dawn. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, taking stock of it. The place she had built from nothing, under her own name, with her own money, in the world she had chosen rather than the one she'd been assigned. It was small and the heater groaned and Ruth brought bread on Saturdays, and the windows needed recaulking before winter arrived properly. It was hers. She made the tea she had not made that morning. She sat at the kitchen table and drank it and watched the sky lighten by degrees. And she put one hand flat on the table and one hand on her stomach, and she sat in the particular quiet of a night that has finally, after everything, agreed to end. 7 weeks later, the baby came. Not easily. There was nothing easy about it, and Isabella, who had prepared herself intellectually for difficulty and had discovered that intellectual preparation for physical extremity is only marginally useful, spent 11 hours in a state that reduced her to the most basic version of herself: breath and muscle and will. Nothing else available, nothing else relevant. The room was bright and loud, with the specific controlled chaos of a medical event, and at various points she was aware of her doctor's voice and the voices of the nurses and the particular sounds of the monitors, and at other points she was aware of nothing except the interior of the effort, which was total and annihilating and demanded everything she had. Lorenzo was in the waiting room. She had told him he could be. She had thought about it for 2 weeks and discussed it with Claire, and discussed it with her doctor, and discussed it, mostly, with herself in the kitchen at 3 a.m. when the insomnia came and the thinking arrived whether she wanted it or not. And she had concluded that the birth of a child was not a place to make statements about the past. It was a beginning, and she was capable of allowing him to be present at the beginning without it meaning she had resolved everything that came before. He was there when the nurse came out. He stood up too fast from the waiting room chair, the way people stand up when they've been wound tight for hours, and the moment of release arrives before they've prepared for it, and the nurse said she's here. They're both doing well, and Lorenzo sat back down immediately, all the way down, elbows on knees, and the nurse, who had seen many things in many waiting rooms, said nothing and went back through the door. He was allowed in 20 minutes later. Isabella was sitting up, exhausted in a way that went beyond anything she had words for, her hair damp, her face stripped of everything non-essential. She was holding the baby against her chest. The baby was small and red-faced and had already demonstrated, in her first 20 minutes of existence, a set of opinions about the world that she was not shy about expressing. She had quieted now. She was simply there, breathing, the impossible specific weight of her. Lorenzo stood in the doorway. He looked at Isabella first, the long look of a man who understands, in his body rather than his head, what the last 11 hours have cost, and who does not have the vocabulary for it, and is not going to pretend he does. Then he looked at the baby. Isabella watched his face. This was the thing she had not been able to predict in all the weeks of practical planning and emotional accounting and careful middle-distance management of her own expectations. She had not been able to predict what his face would do in this moment, because she had never seen him in a moment that was genuinely beyond his management, and this was that moment. And his face did something she had no name for. Not softening, not breaking, but opening, the way a room opens when you remove a wall, revealing space that was always there but had been contained so long it had stopped registering as space. He crossed to the chair by the bed. He sat down. He looked at his daughter. "What's her name?" he said. His voice was different. Not the 42nd floor and not the exposed rawness of the last weeks. Something quieter and more permanent. "Nora," Isabella said. He said it back quietly, not to Isabella, to the small face against Isabella's chest, testing the weight of it, the way you say a word you've been given that you need to make your own. "Can I—" He stopped, started again. "Is it all right if I—" "Yes," Isabella said. She shifted carefully and transferred the baby into his arms, showing him how to support the head the way the nurse had shown her. And he took Nora with the extreme careful deliberateness of a man who is accustomed to handling everything with authority and has just encountered something he is not willing to mishandle, And when Nora was settled against his chest and he looked down at her, the man who had controlled an empire sat in a hospital chair and was, for the first time in Isabella's knowledge of him, completely without resources. Not frightened, not lost. Simply at the absolute end of what power can do for a person and the absolute beginning of something else. He sat with her for a long time. Isabella watched him. She watched the way his hand came up to cover Nora's back, careful, encompassing, the gesture of a man making a wordless promise. She watched the way his breathing slowed to match the baby's. She watched him sit in the bright hospital room with the city moving beyond the window, and she thought about the night in the hallway on the 42nd floor, the 3-inch gap in the door, the baby shoes she'd pressed against her chest while she waited for an elevator. And she thought about the strange mathematics of how you arrive at a place like this, all the pain and the choices and the months of solitary survival, the attorney on the 9th floor and the groaning heater and the gray strip of sky, the tea that went cold and the text sent left-handed in 30 seconds, all of it. And she did not conclude that it had been worth it. That was the wrong frame. It had simply been necessary. Every piece of it had been the only way to arrive at this specific room. She did not forgive him in that room. Forgiveness, she understood by now, was not an event. It was a practice. A thing you did over time, imperfectly, with setbacks, the way you maintain anything that matters. She would have better days with it and worse days, and there would be mornings when the memory of his voice through the 3-inch gap arrived without warning and landed with the full original weight, and she would have to choose again, in that moment, what to carry and what to set down. That was the actual work. The work nobody tells you about because it doesn't have a scene, no moment of music and resolution, just the ordinary day and the choice you make in it. But she could see, in the way he sat with Nora against his chest, that he understood something now he had not understood before. Not because she had taught it to him. She was not responsible for his education, had never been. That was another thing she'd had to unlearn. But because the month of wreckage and consequence had walked him to the edge of something and left him there. And he had looked down at what the fall would cost and had made a choice, not for her, not for the marriage, but for the possibility of becoming someone his daughter could look at without having to explain away. That was his work. She had her own. In the weeks that followed, they built something that had no precedent in their previous life together. He found an apartment 3 blocks from hers, his choice, not her suggestion. And he came in the mornings when she needed rest and left in the evenings without being asked, and he did not push for more than he'd been given, and he did not manufacture moments of meaning. He changed diapers with the same grimly focused competence he brought to everything. He learned how Nora liked to be held when she was inconsolable, on the left side moving, no talking, and he held her that way at 2 a.m. when Isabella was past the point of functioning, and he did it without comment and without expectation of credit. He was, in short, present, the way she had asked him to be. The only thing she'd asked. Marco came by once in the 3rd week with food from a restaurant Isabella had never been to and a card signed only with his name. He stood in the doorway holding the food and looked at Nora in the bouncer seat on the kitchen floor and said nothing for a long moment. "She has his jaw," Marco said finally. "I know," Isabella said. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it. I should have There were things I saw and didn't act on early enough. You came when it mattered. I should have come sooner." She looked at him. "Yeah," she said. "You should have." A pause. "Thank you for the food." He nodded. He left. She thought that was probably the most honest exchange she'd ever had with Marco Rylan, and that it had taken all of this to make it possible, which was the kind of math that only made sense in retrospect. Vanessa Vale left the city. Isabella learned this from Lorenzo 6 weeks after Nora's birth, mentioned without editorializing, a fact delivered the way you deliver a fact that has been processed and filed. She had taken a position with a firm in another city, something legitimate, something that used the organizational skills without the architecture they'd previously served. Lorenzo said this without visible emotion, and Isabella received it the same way. And they moved on to the topic of Nora's first pediatric appointment, because that was the conversation that mattered. Dante Riven left the city as agreed. Lorenzo did not tell her where. She did not ask. Some doors, she had learned, you leave closed not out of avoidance, but out of wisdom, an understanding that what's behind them has been handled and revisiting it serves no one. The empire did not collapse. It contracted, reconfigured, shed its most exposed edges over the following months in ways that Lorenzo managed with the quiet competence that had always been his best quality when it was directed at something worth directing it at. Whether it was conscience or fatherhood or simple exhaustion with the cost of maintenance, she couldn't say, and she decided it wasn't hers to say. He was making choices. She would observe the choices over time and draw conclusions from the pattern, the way you draw conclusions from anything real, not from the declaration but from the accumulation of evidence. She went back to work. She had credentials she'd never fully used, a degree in financial consulting that she'd set aside when the marriage made it seem unnecessary, and she found that 4 years of intimate proximity to the architecture of a complex private organization had given her a practical education no classroom could have matched. Claire referred her to a colleague who needed exactly that skill set, and the colleague was followed by another. And by the time Nora was 4 months old, Isabella Crane had the beginning of something that was entirely and completely her own. She did not take his name back. He did not ask her to. One evening in December, when Nora was just past 3 months and had achieved the specific social milestone of smiling at faces she recognized, Lorenzo arrived at the usual time and found Isabella standing at the kitchen window with Nora on her shoulder, looking out at the street below where the first snow of the season was coming down in the particular slow way of early snow that hasn't yet committed to sticking. He came and stood beside her. Nora turned her head toward him with the slow, uncertain focus of a person who is still calibrating her instruments, and then her face did the thing it did. The whole face smile, unguarded and absolute, the smile of someone who has no history yet, and no defenses, and no reasons not to. Lorenzo looked at that smile, and Isabella watched him look at it, and she thought, there it is. That's the thing that can't be managed or possessed or maintained by force. That's the thing that just arrives or doesn't, and when it does, you either deserve it or you spend your life learning how. She didn't say any of that. It wasn't the kind of thing you said. She shifted Nora slightly and handed her to him, and he took her the way he'd learned to. Confident now, the early carefulness replaced by something more natural, more earned. And Nora grabbed his finger with the full conviction of someone who has decided this particular finger belongs to her. Outside, the snow came down. The kitchen was warm. The heater had been fixed in November by the building super, who Isabella had, over 3 months of polite persistence, convinced that the groaning was a problem requiring professional attention rather than a feature of the building's character. The window she had recaulked herself on a Saturday morning with a YouTube tutorial and a level of determination that had surprised her only slightly. She made tea. She made it for both of them without asking, because she knew how he took it now the way you know things about someone you have stood beside in hard weather, not by being told, but by paying attention. She set his cup on the counter beside him. He was talking to Nora in a low voice, the one he used with her, the one that was different from every other register she'd ever heard from him. Unpolished, unmanaged, slightly ridiculous, in the way that the voices people use with babies are always slightly ridiculous and entirely real. Isabella picked up her own cup. She stood at the window and watched the snow. She thought about the night she had walked into the elevator on the 42nd floor with the paper bag pressed to her chest, her reflection looking back at her from the polished doors, terrifyingly calm. She thought about the woman she'd been then. Not weak. She understood now she had never been weak, but unaware of her own map, unaware of the distance she was capable of traveling or what she would find at the end of it. She had found this. This specific kitchen, this specific evening, this small person who had arrived into the world with opinions and a jaw that belonged to her father and eyes that the doctor said would settle into whatever color they were going to be over the next several months, and that Isabella secretly hoped would be brown, dark brown, the color of her own, so that when she looked at her daughter, she would see something of herself looking back. The road ahead was not uncomplicated. Trust was not restored, it was being built, one day at a time, from materials that had not previously existed. There would be failures in that construction. There would be days when the old memory arrived and sat in the room with them and had to be acknowledged before it could be set aside. There would be negotiations and disagreements and the particular difficulty of two people building something new out of the wreckage of something old, which required you to be honest about the wreckage without living in it. But here was the thing Isabella Crane had learned in the months of solitary survival and the hard-won clarity that follows the kind of loss that strips you to the architecture of yourself. You do not need the story to be clean to build something real inside it. You need only to know what you will not compromise, what you will protect absolutely, and what you are willing to become in order to do the protecting. She knew those things now. She looked at Lorenzo holding Nora in the kitchen of the apartment that was hers, in the life that was hers, in the future she had built with her own hands out of nothing but necessity and refusal and a pair of tiny white shoes she had carried against her chest through the worst of it. And she thought, this is not the life I planned. This is not what I thought love was going to look like. It is harder and less certain and more complicated than anything I imagined when I was the woman choosing a wedding dress for 6 months. It is also the most real thing I have ever stood inside. She drank her tea. Outside, the snow settled on the street below and covered everything that had come before, not erasing it. Snow doesn't erase, it only covers, and what's underneath remains until the thaw. But quieting it. The way things quiet at the end of a long day when the noise finally runs out and what's left is only what was always going to be there. Nora made a sound. Lorenzo said something to her in return, soft and low. Isabella turned from the window and looked at them both, the man she had not forgiven and had not stopped knowing, and the daughter who had no history yet, and an entire one waiting, and she thought, all right, this is the room. This is where we begin. She set down her cup and crossed the kitchen and stood beside him, and looked at her daughter's face, and Nora looked back at both of them with the absolute undefended attention of someone who has just arrived in the world and is still deciding what she thinks of it, and has not yet learned that there is any other way to look at anything. That, Isabella thought, was worth protecting. That was worth everything it had cost to get here. She put her hand on Nora's back, beside Lorenzo's hand, and felt the small, certain warmth of her daughter breathing, and let the evening hold all three of them, and did not ask for anything more than that.